So let me ask you, I'll ask you. So we're going to start right now. Cut. Take one. Eli, thank you so much for being with us. I've had some great conversations with you over the years, and now I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to you in front of the congregation of All Souls, and especially with this being Indigenous Peoples Weekend, Indigenous Peoples Days. It used to be Columbus Day. We now call it Indigenous Peoples Day. And actually, that's a question I've never asked you is what do you think of Columbus and this idea that we celebrate Columbus Day in America?
Columbus has his place in history. He's never been celebrated by Native people because of who he was and what he did. And, of course, the victors write history, not the people who are, the ones being taken advantage of. He has his place in history. I think as far as, the monuments coming down, yes. I think they should be placed historically in a museum, not destroyed, because people need to know what happened and put a face to what happened. Mm-hmm. And but I don't think he needs to be in a prominent place.
Right.
So replacing him with Indigenous Day, it's controversial because a lot of tribal people feel we need our own day. We don't need to replace somebody. Mm-hmm. We need our own day.
Right.
But this is a good start.
Right.
Getting rid of or changing Columbus Day in Tulsa to Indigenous Day is a good day.
Great. Well, let's talk about we talked earlier about how talking about indigenous people and talking about native tribes in Tulsa.
I think, because it's confusing when you see someone who say they're Cherokee or Creek or Chickasaw and they're white. They're blonde hair, blue eye. And they go, yes, it's Indigenous Day. I'm celebrating my people. And you look at them and you think, well, your people are really from Europe. And so you have to understand the differences in what's indigenous and what's tribal and what is a Indian legally in America. An Indian is a person who is a citizen of a federally recognized tribe. And no matter what race that person is, if that tribe recognizes that person as a tribal member, then the U.S. classifies that individual as an Indian. But does that mean indigenous?
Right.
Indigenous people are the people who are in the Western Hemisphere. Mm-hmm. And were here long before the Europeans and Africans got here. To me, that's what indigenous is. So when I think about indigenous people, I'm thinking about people from South America to North America that are indeed indigenous. I'm not necessarily thinking about a person who have an ancestor just on the Dollar's Roll and maybe 1 over 1 million Indian blood, but yet they're tribal members. I know that's controversial, but it kind of would help people explain that if you're a member of a tribe, you are indeed a legal Indian. But does that mean that you are the race of Indians? That's a whole different thing right there.
Yeah, so that's interesting how you can be Creek or Cherokee or one of the other.
It's a political status.
It's a political status. So you can be black, white, Indian, or a mixture of
which
ethnicities.
Usually you are.
Right.
And you are a tribal member. You meet the requirements of the tribe's constitution. And races don't have constitutions. Only governments have constitutional political societies. And so tribes are political societies. There were one time in history, the Creeks or the Cherokees were a race of Indians within their tribal system.
Right.
But 400, 500 years of miscegenation with Africans and Europeans, today they're mixed race people. And today, if you look at the population of the Cherokee Nation or the Chickasaw Nation, they're mainly white people. And there's nothing wrong with that because they meet the requirements of their constitution. But you do have tribes around this country where there is a blood quantum system, and it's 1/2 or more or whatever, And the people are identifiably, you look at them and you go, that's an Indian, you know. But with a lot of tribal members in Oklahoma, particularly with the 5 civilized tribes, you have to ask, are you a Cherokee citizen? Are you a Creek citizen? Often you know that by looking at the tag that they're driving on their car. But do they look racially Indian? No. But then that's the miseducation of Americans or Oklahomans about who Indians are. There's the legal Indian, which are people who are citizens of a federally recognized tribe. And then there's the race of Indians, and the two are often confused.
Right.
And so Indigenous Day can be confusing. You know, when you see people of Mexican descent out in the park celebrating Indigenous Day because they're descendants of Aztecs or Mayans or whatever, they have a right to do it because they're descendants of indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere.
Right. Great.
Got it?
Yes, I really appreciate that. And so then that helps to answer the question of how there came to be so many black or people with African ancestry within these tribal nations. But then there's the group of freedmen who have been excluded. Can you talk a little bit about the freedmen?
Well, the exclusion is a modern day thing. It's not in the past. It's what's happening now, you know. But the tribes, if we're talking about the 5 tribes, the 5 civilized tribes.
Right.
The civilized term was actually coined in the 1870s. They were not called civilized because they owned African slaves. They were called civilized because they created constitutions after the Civil War that were very similar to the U.S. Constitution, and their governments having a legislative, a executive, and a judicial branch. So from those reasons, they were called civilized. And that happened after the Civil War, after slavery. But we're talking about these 5 particular tribes, Creeks in particular, in the Deep South, where my people were from, Alabama and Georgia. The Creeks participated in the enslavement of Africans way before the Trail of Tears or the Removal Act of 1830. They enslaved people of African descent. They also intermarried the white people from Europe. White men from Britain or wherever would marry Indian women and be accepted in the tribe. This went on for a century in the South, you know. So the miscegenation has gone on a very long time. And, you know, but why there are Africans in the tribe and the different classifications of Africans in the Creek Nation. You have Creeks Indian, marrying black people. And the majority of this happened after statehood, but it did happen before statehood. A lot of it happened after the Civil War when the slaves became tribal members. Some of it happened before the Civil War where Indian males particularly, would either rape or have sex with an African slave producing a child. And you have to understand that that child would not have Creek citizenship because a male in the Creek Nation couldn't pass on Creek citizenship. Citizenship was only from the female. So if the female, in this case, was an African person, a person of African descent, wouldn't have tribal membership, nor would the child. Wouldn't have tribal citizenship or Creek citizenship, nor would her child. Her child would remain in slavery. That's called chattel slavery. Right. It's the same as the South. If the mother was a slave, so was the child. So even if that child father was a full-blood Indian, that child still wouldn't have a clan, still wouldn't have a tribal town, still wouldn't be considered a tribal member, but still be considered property of the Creek Nation, you know. So a lot of intermingling happened like that, you know, whether it was forced or whether it was a loving relationship that was kept undercover, it happened, you know. So
and then when slavery ended after the Civil War, anyone who was, whether they were a slave of the tribe or by blood or otherwise, they became members of the Creek Nation.
Yeah. Okay. So The Treaty of 1866 in the Creek Nation was signed July 14, 1866. That's when black people in the Creek Nation was emancipated. And for those of you who think slavery in the U.S. ended on Juneteenth down in Texas in 1865, it went on a whole full year here in Indian Territory. The Seminole Nation Treaty was signed March 21st, 1866. The Choctaw-Chickasaw Treaty was signed April 28, 1866. The Creek Nation Treaty was signed June 14, 1866, followed by the Cherokee Nation Treaty, which was signed July 19, 1866. So actually, black people in Indian Territory who were enslaved by these tribes were enslaved the whole year after the emancipation, not the emancipation, but the Juneteenth celebration in Texas. And I'm only going to speak from a Creek perspective. The former slaves in Article 2 of the 1866 treaty, there were 5 conditions for freedom in the Creek Nation. One, because the Creeks had allied with the Confederate States, signed a treaty with the Confederate States to protect the sovereign right to enslave black folk, they lost the war. As a condition of surrender, there was a lot happened. They lost the western half of their lands, which became Oklahoma Territory. And in Article 2 of the treaty, the tribe was not to enslave anybody anymore unless it was punishment of crime, where someone had committed a crime and they're in prison. Their punishment could be slavery for a period of time. The second thing was that the former slaves were now their tribal members. That's in the treaty. They became tribal citizens of the Creek Nation. The third thing was that they were to have a share, an equal share of the national funds. If the Creeks were to get $100, the freedmen, now called freedmen, the former slaves, were to share in that $100, an equal share. They would have a share in the soil, meaning they had a right to live here and live on the land. And mind you, in those days, no one owned land in the Creek Nation. Only the Creek government owned the land. So the land was actually owned in common. So when you hear these outrageous stories of like the Pyramid family owning 500,000 acres or some other family owning that was not true. The Creeks would give leases to their tribal members that lasted for 2 years. And after 2 years, whoever made that lease would have to come back to the council and have the council approve it for another 2 years. If that person died somewhere in between, he couldn't leave his heirs that property. Those heirs would have to come back to the council and say, could we renew this lease for another 2 years? That's the way the law was, how Creeks actually regulated their soil. And the former slaves had a right to that. And then lastly, the fifth thing was that the federal government was to recognize the freedmen as native citizens, as Indians, basically. Those were the conditions in Article 2 of the 1866 treaty for the Creeks. The other tribes, there was pretty much same conditions. It varied. The Choctaws and the Chickasaws wanted to be paid for each of his freed slaves or the slaves they were freeing. I believe it was $300,000 that they were going to split between themselves. I think the Chickasaws was going to get $100,000. And if they didn't adopt the freedmen as citizens, then the monies were going to go to the freedmen instead of to the tribes. And these two tribes actually passed council resolutions, laws, that adopted their slaves and made them citizens so they can get that money, basically. And the Chickasaw Nation actually rescinded the agreement when the allotment period started. They didn't want to give the freedmen any land, so they rescinded it and revoked the law, but they had already gotten the money. But the government didn't do anything about it, and it ended up in the Court of Claims, and the judge actually blamed the U.S. Congress for not ratifying that language that was in their treaty, and therefore the Chickasaws were able to boot their blacks out, even though they'd been paid to make them citizens. It's disgusting.
Wow.
So the Choctaws actually, freedmen remained in their tribes until 1982. And then Choctaw Nation booted them out.
1982.
1982. Matter of fact, the Choctaw Nation sued the federal government in the 1950s to get the rest of the money that they were promised in the treaty for freeing their blacks and making them citizens. And they got it. And then 30 years later, in 1982, they booted them out. The Creek Nation, actually, the freedmen, the former slaves of the Creeks, known as Creek Freedmen, during the Reconstruction years, lived a remarkable life. Unlike black people in the States, the Creek Freedmen treated their blacks just like regular tribal members. There was no issues whatsoever. And they were in serving in the council and the House of Kings and House of Warriors. The Creeks had created 3 new tribal towns for them. The Creeks at that time, were 44 different tribal towns. In the South, before the removal, we were 82 tribal towns that came to Indian Territory during the removal. But through that 4 decades, a lot of those tribal towns basically died off and merged with other tribal towns. So by the end of the Civil War, only 44 actually existed. But for the former slaves who had no tribal town, the tribe created 3 more. They named them after the rivers in the Creek Nation: Arkansas Colored, Canadian Colored, and Norfolk Colored. And from there, they elect a member to the House of Kings and members to the House of Warriors based on their population. And they became very active in the Creek society and Creek government. The first person of African descent to actually serve on the Supreme Court was actually a black man who was a former slave of the Creek named Jesse Franklin. He had been enslaved 12 years earlier, and before he was actually put on the Creek Nation Supreme Court in 1878. And he died on that court. Now, this brother can actually put you to death. He could sentence an Indian who had enslaved him to death if that person had committed murder. You know, so, but, you know, little is known about that in Oklahoma history because Oklahoma history does not teach Indian history. And a lot of the tribes are in denial about the freedmen history and their indigenous ancestry. I always find it strange when we could talk about the Perryman family, for example, and the Creek Perryman family, and give them all their due and respect as Creeks, yet they're a mixed race, black and white. And nobody ever, say they're not Creek. But then when you're talking to freedmen descendants and they say they're Creek, all of a sudden there's no, you're not, you're black.
Color line.
Yeah, there's that color line right there. And even the black people who were not freedmen that were members of the tribe, they were part Indians, like Silas Jefferson and people like that. When you see Silas Jefferson, who was actually the Miko, a town king of Tuskegee Tribal Town, and he's identifiably a black guy, and he's in picture or photo with other Indian people who are town kings themselves, people are like, well, why is the black guy in that picture? You know, they don't see him as Creek, yet they see the obvious Indians in the photo as Creek, and the one white guy in that same photo as a Creek. They don't even question that, you know. So the racism has been around and is thick as you could cut it with a butter knife. You know, so, but, you know, your question about why are there black people and white people in the Creek Nation is because of slavery, the enslavement of Africans, the institution of slavery that the Creek Nation adopted years ago, centuries ago, and the fact that they miscegenated, intermarried white people, white men particularly, in the Southeast before they even came here. You know, and then even after statehood, when Oklahoma became a state, and people married who they wanted to marry. You know, there was no sense of, I got to marry another tribal member. A lot of Indian women, a lot of freedmen women married state whites and state blacks. And so we're now a century away from statehood. And so you have a extremely mixed race tribe, and the majority of the tribal members in the 5 civilized tribes are actually white people. They have an ancestor on the rolls, they have a right to be in the tribe, but if you look at their birth certificates when they're enrolled, it's Caucasian, you know. And then you have many that say Negro or black, but they have a right to be members. My problem, though, with the tribes is that, particularly with the Creeks, in 1979, we wrote a new constitution. And people in 1979 decided to boot the blacks out, boot the freedmen out. And the argument that the chief at that time, his name was Claude Cox, used was that, well, the freedmen don't have Indian blood, so why should they be a member of the Creek Nation? And to me, it's such a strange question that why didn't people clap back at this man and say, when did you go out buying slaves that had Indian blood? You know, when you brought the slaves on the Trail of Tears and they were pulling the wagons like oxen, they were your property. They had no rights to even be on the Trail of Tears. They didn't have any rights on the Trail of Tears, no different than the chicken, the cows. They were property. They were chattel property. And nobody at that time said in the Removal Act that you can only take slaves with you that had Indian blood. You took Negroes with you, and you brought them out here to rebuild the society that you had in the South. And it was fine and dandy until the Civil War broke out, and our tribe decided to ally with the Confederate States to protect their sovereign right to enslave black people, or what they thought. And it was conditions of surrender, and they lost, and, you know, so it happened. And then in 1979, the Creek Nation just decided to renege on that promise of Article 2 of the 1866 treaty and boot them out. And then put the propaganda out where they don't have Indian blood. And it's almost like saying, you know, I grew up in Mississippi. My dad is from Oklahoma. My mother's from Mississippi. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember the Negro drinking fountains and the white drinking fountains and restaurants you couldn't go into and all this stuff. I'm old enough. I'm old enough to remember the marches from Dr. King back in the 60s down in Jackson, Mississippi, and all of that stuff that was going on. And it's probably what shaped my activism as a person today, because I could see the older people's anger and what was going on. I didn't understand it, but I could feel it. So, but I've never met a person of African descent from that state who says, I have all the rights in this state of Mississippi because I have white blood. My 5th great grandfather was a white man, so therefore I have rights in this state. And that's basically what the Creek Nation was telling the black folks. Unless you could prove you have Indian blood, or that Indian who raped your African grandmother, you can actually prove it through legal documents, you have no rights in this tribe, which is wrong, morally wrong, because we made a moral promise to them after a civil war where thousands, hundreds of thousands of people gave their lives to fight in. They made the decision of what was going to happen. And the audacity of somebody 100 and some years after that war to just, you know, next to a television set, well, I want the Negroes out because they don't have Indian blood. To me, it's crazy. Yeah. You know?
I want to thank you very much for that. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of the Africans who were associated with the tribes of Oklahoma, that the role that they played in the founding of Black Wall Street and the Greenwood District and some of that history.
It's actually, it goes back to the allotments. The federal government started in the 1870s pushing statehood. And they came here in Indian Territory, the Senate did, having hearings called the Conditions of Indians in Indian Territory. They interviewed the former slaves, and they interviewed full-bloods, and they interviewed mixed whites. They interviewed white people living among the Indians. And they were saying, well, don't you want to be an American? They were dangling out the citizenship Oh, how precious American citizenship was. And when it came to the Indians, particularly the full-bloods and the former slaves, the freedmen, they were like, no, we don't want that. No, thank you. We're satisfied being Creek. And the black people in particular were saying, the way you're treating black folks in Arkansas, you want this to become a state so we could be treated like that? No, thank you. So all of this was actually pushed because the Indian agents, particularly during the Civil War, were writing letters to the U.S. War Department saying they're stepping in oil. And the place smells like natural gas, all of this. This is all before the Industrial Revolution. And so by the 1870s and 80s, as America began to reboom and needing oil for everything,
right,
and burning of natural gas, and they couldn't hardly use natural gas then because you couldn't pipe it during that time, but you could certainly get oil. They started pushing it. And then you had the Oklahoma land run that happened in 1889, which was a violation of the 1866 treaty that nobody talks about. In Article 3 of the 1866 treaty, it specifically says who the land could be given to when they took it from the Creeks. And it was other Indians and freedmen, but not the freedmen from the Creek Nation who became tribal members. It was talking about black people from Mississippi, Tennessee, Kentucky. Basically, during those times, there was a push from Southern whites in particular to get rid of the Negro problem by removing them. If we can't have them as property, let's just move them like we removed the Indians just 30 years earlier. And so in the 1866 treaty, there's language that says the other Indians, meaning the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Potawatomi and tribes like that, and freedmen, meaning former black slaves of the states. Well, that part never happened, but they did move the Indians out west. And so there was so much land left in surplus that the federal government opened it up to land runs, basically because white people started showing up there. And they lobbied Congress to basically open this up and give us the rest of it. Anyway, everybody in this state knows about the Sooner runs and all of this stuff in 1889. Well, these same people started looking to the east, to Indian Territory, where the 5 tribes had the majority of the land and few population. There was not that many people here for this much land. And so why can't you open up that and give us those lands as well? This is starting the argument. And then you had industrialists going, well, we want the gold, we want the oil, we want the black gold, We want the forest. We want the coal. We want all the resources. There's rivers galore and lakes galore to the east of us. Why can't we have those things? But these things were owned by tribes. So illegally, after 1890, white people started to immigrate into Indian Territory, particularly like areas like where Tulsa became, in this area north of here. And they started to squat illegally. And they started to complain to Washington about, well, the Creeks won't allow us to build schools. The Creeks won't allow us to put plumbing in our homes that we built. The Creeks won't allow this. And the Creek Nation was saying, it's because you are illegally here. You don't have a right to be here. So you need to pack your bags and go back west to Oklahoma Territory or back to the states. This was the argument. But the immigrating whites had more friends in Washington than the Indians did, and they got away with it. And finally, on March 1st, March 1st, 1900, the Township Act was passed that created Tulsa Township. The federal government, Congress allocated monies for the plotting of Tulsa. It was all done through the Creek Nation because the Creek Nation still owned the land. I think it was 653 acres set aside, which was like a square mile and 13 acres or so set aside for town site Tulsa. The Creeks hired the Patton brothers from Greenwood, Arkansas, to plot out the area. They were paid to do it. They were paid to name the streets and all of this stuff. Anybody ever want a map of it, you can go to my Facebook. I got it up on my Facebook. It's in 1902 when it was actually approved. And all the streets are named. Greenwood, 1st Street, 2nd Street, all of that area. Later, Archer, much later. But Greenwood is actually there. And when you talk about Greenwood, that's not in downtown Tulsa, you're talking about the Cherokee Nation. A lot of people don't realize that Mount Vernon is in the Cherokee Nation. The Greenwood Cultural Center is in the Cherokee Nation. When you come to the south of Mount Vernon, just before you come under the bridge, you're now walking into the Creek Nation. It literally sits on the border of the Creek and Cherokee Nation. The ballpark that's there is on the boundaries of the Creek and Cherokee Nation. The Reconciliation Park that's there. The toilets are in the Cherokee Nation, but the monument is in the Creek Nation. So it's on the boundary. Now, Township Tulsa wasn't an allotment. Township Tulsa was set aside by act of Congress, the 650-some acres, and the lots that were actually sold, the Department of Interior gave the money back to the Creek Nation. But the Creeks couldn't buy the lots. They were only sold to white people. But the part that's in the Cherokee Nation was an allotment, and it belonged to a woman named Mary Turley. Everybody's familiar with Turley, Oklahoma. Jim Turley created Turley, Oklahoma, who happened to be a white man who married a Cherokee Indian woman, his second wife, by the way. He was really wife shopping, Indian wife shopping. He married her, made sure she got that allotment, which was on the edge of Township Tulsa as a Cherokee citizen, and then he started to develop it. And Mary Turley is often confused with O.W. Gurley. That myth that O.W. Gurley bought 40 acres and built this is just not provable. You just go to the title records and see that didn't happen. Mary Turley, and I think what happened is that somebody saw Mary Turley and assumed there was a G instead of a T, and the myth kind of was repeated and posted in books and in writings and on and on and on, and no one ever took the time to go down to the title office or call the Cherokee Nation themselves and to their realty department and say, who did this land belong to? And you would have been told. Or even Googled it on the internet. It's right on the internet. So the Greenwood community itself was not on freedmen allotments, and so you can't say this was black land that black people created this town upon. It was Cherokee land and Creek Nation land. Now, the reason when Greenwood was developed and why it was successful was because of Jim Crow laws. In that area of Tulsa where they started to build their town up, black people can only spend money with black people. These were the Jim Crow laws. Okay, so now we go back to the allotments. The Creek Freedmen, the former slaves of the tribe, were given 160 acres apiece. Women, men, babies, 160 acres apiece. If you were living between 1898 and 1906, the cutoff date was April 26, 1906. It's called the Burke Act of April 26, 1906. That's when they cut the allotments off. But if you were 99 years old and living between that time period, meaning you were born in 1800, you got 160 acres. If you were a full-blood, you got 160 acres. If you were a freedman, just pure African freedman, and you were 1 year old, but you were living in that time period, you got 160 acres. It was an equal share across the board. It wasn't based on your title, whatever. It was just based on the fact that you were a tribal member. The freedmen combined in the Creek Nation allotments totaled 1,192,240 acres. And that's just in the Creek Nation reservation, 1,192,240 acres. Then you have a third of the Creeks having some African ancestry during that time. I'm talking about the Indians.
Right.
So literally half of the Creek Nation allotments were to black folk. And let me explain why I say to black folks, because under the new state of Oklahoma, a drop of Negro blood made you black. I see people all the time, I love genealogy, I love doing research, where I see these Indian families who are like 3/4 on the Dawes Roll. On the U.S. population census in 1900, Indian, all the way down. On the 1910, Indian, all the way down, the whole family. The 1920 population, Negro, all the way down because of their one drop of African blood. These are people who were classified as Indians. And of course, the freedmen were just classified as black on the population census. So when you look at towns like, you read books like the All Black Towns in Oklahoma, and they only talk about Bowley's Main Street with a bank, and Bowley's Main Street with a grocery store, and this and that and that. But you miss the fact that black folk who were black Indian or freedmen owning 100,000 acres around Bowley in those days of early statehood, where agriculture and oil and gas production was the economy for Oklahoma. And so money wasn't made on Main Street. It was just spent on Main Street. It was made in the rural areas. And in those rural areas during those times was black land ownership. And so Greenwood, in particularly, with its hotel, $10 a week hotel didn't make anybody a millionaire. It gave you jobs in retail stores that people lease from their, from their commercial real estate people, or the stores, and all of that is an economy where the money is circulating, but it's not being made there. In Oklahoma, it was made in the rural areas where cotton was being grown, peanuts, any type of agricultural products during those years that went up and down. And then you got the fact that, and this is what's often missing in the hostility story of Greenwood in times like that, is why immigrating white people in particularly were angry. This is very important. If you were a white person from Mississippi and you didn't have a pot to piss in, can I say that?
Sure. Yeah, no more. You're from Mississippi, didn't have
okay, and you get here and you're looking for your black gold, meaning you're looking for something, for a job and to get your family started. But you want a sharecrop. And chances are when you went out to talk to a landowner about sharecropping his land, you're talking to a black person who happened to be a tribal member. Unlike the black folks from the States, it was different. And you got a black person who probably hardly spoke English. First language was probably Creek or Cherokee. It was a different life here.
Right.
And so you're producing crops, and, like during the 1921 race massacre, people don't realize what happened with Oklahoma's economy going on at the same time. It wasn't going so great, particularly with agriculture, because most of the people had bet these crops on Europe buying their crops, because it was the end of World War I. And all of a sudden, by that time, Europe started growing their own cotton, and their peas, and their corn, and their tomatoes, and potatoes. They started doing it themselves. There's no need to ship it from America. And so what happened? Boom, crops went through the floor. But you still owe the sharecropper. So there was a lot of resentment going on, a lot of anger, a lot of poverty growth, on and on. Then you had the oil and gas, but then more importantly, you had the anger from the black side too. You had the state blacks, the state immigrants, black people who immigrated from the States. You had the native blacks, black people who have been here since the 1830s, known as the native blacks, who were either freedmen or Creeks with African ancestry, the native blacks. And the state blacks. You had their whole fight between themselves, and the resentment going on there. For every 20, by 1920, for every Creek person, whether he was black, white, or red, to every state person who was black, white, or red, it was 20-1. They had outpopulated the Creek population here. And so there was resentment there. Then you have this state that was created where half the land was allotted to women. No voting rights, but they are landowners. Then you have another third of the land of Indian Territory allotted to black folk, who were also not given voting rights in the state of Oklahoma. But they were the landowners. And you can have I always get tickled by this, you can have a white person move here from Kentucky in 1910 and been here 1 week to register to vote, a white man. And yet you have black folks that's been here since the 1820s and 30s who were the landowners that had no rights in the state of Oklahoma. None. How does that make any sense?
Right.
And yet these people will go to Oklahoma City, create these laws to dispossess these black people of their lands. And I often say what's missing in black town stories is that they talk about the demise of the black communities and black towns in Oklahoma. And in Greenwood, it's often blamed on the freeway.
Right.
And I'm like, brother, roll that back. You're missing the bigger picture. You've just missed the forest because you're looking at a tree, which is the freeway. But you missed the forest. You got to understand at statehood in Oklahoma, in eastern Oklahoma, which was Indian territory, black folks own a third of the land. There was a lot of money to be made. And so these towns sprung up, did extremely well. Booker T. Washington wrote about it. Bowley, Taft, all these places, Grayson, Renniesville, Muskogee, which was much wealthier than Greenwood by far. And they did extremely well at statehood. You get to the 1940s and 50s. Matter of fact, when Greenwood was rebuilt, you have to understand, why was it rebuilt back better in just a few years?
Right.
You know, and you say, oh, it was the economy and it was the need for this and that. Yes, it was. It was also because in the 1920s, black folks still owned much of the land around here. And so monies were still being made, and the only place they could spend it, particularly if you live northeast of the river, the Arkansas River, which played a huge role in where you spent your money, because you couldn't get across that river so easily like today. We just drive across it. Back in those years, when most people were still pushing their mule and wagons and stuff, few people had cars, they had to get across the river. Right. So you tend to do business where your land was. If you were southwest of the river, you did business in those particular black towns south of the river. If you were north of the river, like in Wagner County, and most of Wagner County was actually allotted to the freedmen, the majority of it. You would know that today.
No.
But when you look on the allotment maps, you look, oh my God, all this land is black folk land. So by the 1930s, when the the Great Depression started, and freedmen started to, couldn't grow anything, couldn't have sharecroppers, right. Nothing. A lot of the laws that the state of Oklahoma passed was actually against them. They were being taxed. You got to understand, too, that 1-year-old that received an allotment, or that 2-month-old that was born in February of 1906 that got 160 acres, at a certain point, Oklahoma started taxing that 2-month-old for property taxes if he was black. Yep.
Only if he was black?
Yeah, the Indians, if you were half or more, there were some restrictions. And then there were the mixed Indians with a lesser blood quantum. They were taxed, but they tended to do better than the black folk. The Creek Nation school system that was actually segregated before statehood. The Creek Nation has a segregated school system where it had colored schools and Indian schools. And a lot of folks don't know that where Jinx Elementary School, yes. That's actually a Black Creek town called Renty's Grove. And a colored school was there called Renty's Grove that Creek Nation built. I think Buck Colbert Franklin's brother or uncle was the principal of that school. Okay. And they're actually Freedmen descendants. They actually be Choctaw Freedmen descendants. And you have school systems all around that the Creek Nation had, but they were segregated. The black freedmen or the black Indians went to those schools. White and Indians went to Indian schools. And so, unfortunately, separate is not always equal as everybody knows today, and that's what was going on. And black folks didn't get the good education that a lot of the other schools got, So the white Indian probably did better than the Indian and the black by far when it came to the allotments. We only know that because look at the wealthiest man during that time, which was Thomas Gilchrist, who happened to be a white citizen of the Creek Nation. Did really well. And yet people who were freedmen, who allotments, were in the Glen Pool, didn't have a pot to piss in by 1930 either. You got to understand what happened to their,
Right.
you know, so, but back to why the black communities and towns did well and how did the freedmen play a role in it. It was because the freedmen allotments in the rural area where the economy really was in Oklahoma, they spent their money in black communities because they had no choice. And that's what generated the growth and the need for hotels and stuff. Because the freedmen, you know, when someone said, well, how many freedmen were in Greenwood? You have to look at the U.S. population census in 1920 and then identify the freedmen on that population census to actually get the number.
Right.
But the majority of people actually were state blacks from the states that actually immigrated here. But the freedmen who were landowners, why would they live in the urban area when they actually have 160 acres apiece somewhere else? You know? So anyway, that's
fascinating. And I'm curious. We hear a lot. We've been hearing a lot about the Osage and what happened with folks coming in and taking advantage of them and their allotments, marrying into and a bunch of murders that we've been reading about. Same thing happened with the Creek?
The Osages are not immune to that story. That happened in the Creek Nation, it happened in Cherokee Nation, Choctaw, Chickasaw, it just happened. I encourage your church members to, there's a book called Searching for Sarah Rector. Sarah Rector was the richest black girl in America in 1914. She was a Creek Freedman who received her allotment when she was 2 years old, over near Drumright in the Creek Nation, producing millions of barrels a week on her allotment. She's running around with no shoes on. And yet the Jones family, which pretty much bought her mineral rights, built the big mansions, bunch of them. You know, and finally the NAACP in 1914 came and got her to save her life because her people were disappearing. And they took her to Kansas. This is a little black girl. And they came up with this fake birth certificate, making her Caucasian, so she can open up a bank account and receive her oil and gas rights. She became very successful in life. She had businesses in Muskogee and Kansas. She built a mansion, on and on and on and on. But she never really came back. I always wondered, you know, you can go to Drumright and go to the Sarah Rector's allotment. Everybody's heard of Jackson Barnett, the richest Indian in the world. Sarah Rector's allotment, this Freedman girl, Creek Freedman girl, allotment is within miles of that. You know, George Crumey, your church member, he took me out there on my bucket list tour. And I was surprised that all of these jacks that were still out there pumping had her name on it. Sarah Rector,
Really?
You know, Jack number 41, number 2, number 9. It was God knows how many in the heyday made up that was out there pumping. But that was her oil and gas, you know. And so the tragedy of her life and what happened to her family is written in the book. But it happened to so many other people, the Manuel brothers, you know. The way that the freedmen were given allotments along the Arkansas River were suspicious because it looked like the best agricultural lands in the tribe, and yet they were easy pickings because the federal government then removed the protections that it gave the Indians from their allotments, and white people and black people from the states started to come in and basically swoop up their lands. There's a nasty word that was used back in the day. It begins with an N, and it ends with "izing." And what they would do, particularly during the Depression and other times, they would go to these freedmen allotments, and people were hungry, and you had the Dust Bowl going on and all this stuff. And crops wasn't worth anything. You couldn't sell anything. They would have $400 in dollar bills. And then they have a $100 bill. And they'll roll up the $1 bills, all 400 of them. and then they'll wrap it with the $100 bill and put a rubber band behind it, over it. It's really thick. You just try it. And these freedmen people would be solicited to sell or sign over mineral rights to these land speculators or these oil and gas people. And they would say, no, Granny or Grandpa or whoever told us never to sell our land. You need to leave, sir, blah, blah, blah. And the guy would just reach in his back pocket and put the money on the table. And when you're hungry, that looks like a lot of money. And they're like, you're going to get so much more of this if you just put your X right here. You know? So they would do it just to get the money, you know? And this would supposedly be a mineral lease, but not selling the land. And then next thing you know, they're getting an eviction notice within a year. And they take it to court saying, we didn't sell our land. And the judge said, well, this guy is showing me your ex. Will you sign it? Well, we didn't know how to read. He just told us to sign this for this, you know, wad of money, but it was for the oil and gas. And the judge would say, well, the person that you're actually suing isn't the person that you signed that document with, because the oil and gas speculator would actually sell the land. That person would sell it to somebody else. That person would sell it again. And by the time it's before the judge, it's been sold 5 times. And the judge would then look and say, it's not the last person's fault who bought it, so you got to go. Too bad. Wow. That happens so many times. Wow. And then you have this issue with the funeral homes, with the Indian funeral homes and the black funeral homes, where your granny would die, and you had no money. This went on up into the 1960s, which reminded me I was going to tell you something about the demise of the black towns and why that happened.
Okay.
But this funeral business, granny would die back in the 1950s. And the funeral bill would be like $650. And you don't have any money to pay it. But granny had 160 acres. And the funeral guy would go, hey, why don't you sign over the 120 surplus of that 160? And I'll hold it for 3 months, and you can then come back and pay me when you get it, and I'll give you back your land, wow, your deed. That woman wouldn't be in the ground on the dirt before that man would be on the phone and marketing that property to somebody else. That happened so many times. It was stuff like that. Now back to the demise of the African communities here, the black communities.
Yeah. As
the freedmen started to lose their land through the decades, by the 1960s and 70s, most of it was gone. Only about 20% of the land remained in black hands in the 1960s. You can also see the demise of Bowley, of all these other black towns, Greenwood and others. They were part of it. You know, people blame it over, well, we got rid of the Jim Crow laws and black people can shop anywhere they want. You know, that was part of it. The other part of it was that the rural area, the country lands that black people owned in this state had disappeared. The state had come up with schemes, tax schemes, all kinds of stuff to take their lands, and they successfully did it. And so Bowley, these Grayson, Renniesville, all of these little black communities in Greenwood started their demise because black folks started owning property. And here's the thing with owning property. It gives you credit. And you're over now in an urban environment where you're renting an apartment, you have no collateral to get credit or to buy a home and do things like that. When you once used to own 160 acres, when you once used to own, just among the freedmen, 1,192,240 acres that was debt-free. Think about this. 1900 in Georgia. Huge black population in Georgia in 1900. Combinedly in the whole state, only 1 million acres were owned by black folks. And much of that was in debt. It had been mortgaged or gotten on credit. Not here. Black people were allotted land free and clear of debt. They had none. You know, so the creditors went after them. And the tax people went out, the state went after them. You know, so, but that brings us back to today, in 2020, what's going on with the freedmen. Right. And when I keep telling people, when I see these folks screaming Black Lives Matter, and you don't understand that if you're not talking about the freedmen, those black people in Oklahoma, you're not talking about Black Lives Matter. Because as a tribal member, you're not only entitled to the rights of the native citizens, which is housing, health care, college grants, all these, jobs, on and on and on. It's multiple things from these billion-dollar tribes, particularly the 5 tribes. You're being denied access to that. But you're also denied access to the federal contracts.
Right.
You know, you think about Mark Wayne Marlin, one of the whitest people in Congress. He's a Cherokee. His plumbing company is doing well because of fat contracts, like getting to do the River Spirit when it was under development. The Margaritaville, all of that. That wasn't a $100 job for a plumber. Trust me. You know, and you have to do that as a federal contractor, as an Indian, getting a federal contract, because all of that business, the Creek Nation have to go through the federal government to get it built. You know, so all of those things like that, like building roads and bridges and all the stuff that you see tribes do in the rural area, are denied freedmen. They're being denied that as well. You know, so not only were they banished in my tribe in 1979, they've been fighting for their rights to be back in the tribe. We had a lawsuit for the Seminole Nation, who put their blacks out in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was president. And Bill Clinton just, you know, locked the doors. Seminoles ended up in court of Oklahoma. And the freedmen, Seminole freedmen, who were defended by a guy named John Veely in the Justice Department, won that case against the Seminole Nation. And then immediately after the Seminole freedmen won their treaty rights back, the Seminole Nation passed Jim Crow laws, basically saying, well, you can be a tribal member, but you get no rights. You know, so when they try to take that to court, the courts always say that's a sovereignty issue. It's because it's a sovereignty issue, we don't want to hear that.
So you're saying the equivalent to Jim Crow laws,
Same thing. You could
created in the 1980s,
1990,
1990s here in the
and
United
2000.
States,
Yeah.
among
Right. And the other tribes, the Creek Nation, by the way, kicked their blacks out in 1979, followed by the Choctaw Nation in 1982. Then the Cherokee, the Seminole Nation tried it in 1998, but it ended up in a court lawsuit. Then it was followed by the Cherokee Nation voting their blacks out in 2000 something, 2002 or 3 or whatever it was, you know. And the Cherokee Nation was able to, the Cherokee Freedmen was actually took it to the courts. They won it in tribal courts, lost some in tribal courts, and ended up in federal court. They ended up in Washington, D.C., in district court there, where they actually won their case. Because the Justice Department, who they were actually suing, the Cherokee Freedmen were not suing the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation is sovereign, and you have to be allowed to sue them. So there was the other party to the treaty, which was the United States government. So the Cherokee Freedmen sued the U.S. government to say, you have to protect our treaty rights. This ended up in district court in Washington, D.C., and eventually the Cherokee Nation won their case. Now, currently, there is a Creek Freedmen lawsuit that's going on currently in the Creek Nation case. There was just one recently where the Creek Supreme Court ruled against a man named Ron Graham, who's a Creek Freedman fighting for his rights. And they didn't even rule on the treaty, which is really hypocritical for this reason. Everybody knows about the McGirt case, and everybody's really afraid about the McGirt case. White people being taxed by the tribe. I'm going to give you up front. They can't do it because there's an act of Congress that say they can't tax you. So end that now. Okay, so it's nonsense for it to be written in a paper. They're in the Organic Act that created this state. The tribes can't tax white folk. Okay, so we'll end that there. Okay, so, but the McGirt case was about these 2 tribal members, one a Creek and one a Seminole, Murphy and McGirt, did some hideous thing. Murphy murdered some people or murdered a guy or some, I don't know. And McGirt actually was a child rapist. He was defended by some white attorneys in Oklahoma City, And they were basically saying that the state had no right to prosecute them because of the treaties, that the only court that could prosecute them was the tribal court and the federal court. Well, this ended up in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, that's right, that's what the treaty says, because Congress never did away with the Creek Nation reservation. If the crime was committed in a reservation by a tribal member, that tribal member has to be prosecuted in tribal court or federal court or both. The Creek Nation didn't spend a nickel on that lawsuit, by the way. They may be raving about it. Oh, we won this lawsuit. No, you didn't win that lawsuit. The white attorneys for those two criminals won that lawsuit. You're benefiting from their lawsuit that you didn't participate in. Let's just be honest about that. So the ironic thing was that it was based on the 1866 treaty, Article 3. Just before Article 3 is Article 2, the same thing that freed the blacks and gave them the rights. And in Robert's dissent, he even said the Creeks actually had slaves and gave their black citizenship. You know, it's right there. So when the Creek Nation is going around, the audacity of them telling white people and state black people here that it's mandatory that you follow the treaty, and yet they're hypocritically ignoring the treaty when it comes to their former slaves, it's the epitome of being a hypocrite. You know, you're telling the court, you're telling the state, and you're telling the federal government that you better honor the treaty, yet you got your feet on the neck of the freedmen, denying them their right to their treaty rights, forcing them to wear badges of slavery. You know, Seminole Nation has passed Jim Crow laws. The other tribes, the Choctaw, Cherokee, and the Creeks, are forcing their freedmen to wear badges of slavery. They can't have any rights. They're literally wearing badges of slavery in 2020. So when you're talking about Black Lives Matter in Tulsa, which is in the Creek Nation, and yet you're not talking about this tribe that has its knee, its attorney general has its knee on the neck of their freedmen saying, well, they don't have Indian blood, without saying, well, we never had slaves with Indian blood, or that wasn't a qualification to be a slave, is that you got to be part Indian too.
Right.
You know. And yet telling these people, we're not going to give you any rights, but we're going to make Oklahoma follow the treaty. And by the way, for the last 20 years that I've been involved in this, the only people that ever really screamed about the treaty were the freedmen. And these tribes were saying, the treaty doesn't matter, the treaty doesn't matter. It's old, it's antiquated, it's 100 and some years old, 50 years old. Why should we follow that treaty that they used to follow? We're under the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, which is the act of Congress, not the treaty. That's what they've been saying. Now that the lawsuit, McGirt case, was decided, now it's all about the treaty. But they're hoping that you don't talk about their former slaves, who actually had rights in those same treaties. And it was, you know, so I'm all for Indigenous Day, but I'm also all for the truth about the reality of what these tribes, particularly the 5 tribes, are about. You know, when you're talking about Indigenous people, are you talking about tribal members today, or are you talking about Indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere? Because if you're going to talk about tribal members and not look at the books of citizenship, the rolls, and you see the majority of the people are actually identifiably white, and you would never think they are actually native Indians, then that's a different conversation, you know. But if you want to talk about a recognition day for the Muskogee Creek Nation, and a recognition day for the Cherokee Nation people, or the Choctaw, we have those celebrations. We have the Creek Nation Festival that we do every June that everybody's invited to. The Cherokee Nation has this Cherokee Day in September that everybody's invited to. The other tribes have some going on themselves, you know, that they invite non-tribal members out to celebrate, on and on and on. That is a holiday about them, you know. But in my eyes, when I think about Indigenous people, I'm thinking about the Mexican Indigenous, the Peruvian indigenous, the indigenous people in Brazil, the indigenous people in Cuba, the indigenous people in Puerto Rico, the indigenous people in Canada, everybody. Not just Indian people of the 5 tribes in Oklahoma who are hard to identify as being Indian, but they're legally Indian, you know. And it's an uncomfortable conversation to have here because people feel, and I tell people all the time when they come up to me and someone would say, well, I'm part Cherokee, and I'm part Creek, or I'm part Choctaw. And I would just look at them, what part are you talking about? Is it your hands? What part are you talking about? I understand what they're saying, but the point of it is you can't be part of a political society. I'm part Democrat. I'm part Oklahoman. Right. You know, either you are a citizen of the state or you're not. Either you have voting rights in the state of Oklahoma or you don't. Right. You know, so in the Creek Nation, either you're a Creek citizen or you don't. I'm not caring about your blonde hair, blue eyes, or your black hair and your black eyes and your people are from out. If you are a tribal member of these tribes and you have voting rights, then you're a tribal member, period. You know, but does that make you indigenous? I don't think so. That's a different story.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that and cleaning that up for us. Tell me about this piece of property that All Souls is on. What do you know about that?
This was Tuckabutchie's allotment. He was 85 years old. He was an old Creek guy who was on the Trail of Tears. He's often confused with other Tuckabutchies because there were other Tuckabutchies who were actually slavers. I'm not sure if he was or not. We don't know. His family, some of his family members says no, but there's no record other than you see on the slave schedules, Tuckabutchie owning a bunch of slaves. Now, are they talking about this Tuckabutchie? I have no idea. But this particular one was a member of the Loja Boja tribal town. His people are kind of given the story of landing at the Council Oak Tree, the Loja people. And if that is the case, if that actually is what happened, then Tuckabutchie would have been at that tree when it landed because he would have been a kid on the Trail of Tears, a young man. And he's the one that had this land here. Did he live on it? He possibly could have because his Loja Boja people were in the Tulsa area. The Creeks being these many different tribal towns. Though they lived anywhere they wanted to in Indian Territory, families tend to stick together. And the Loja people, meaning turtle people, tend to stay up in this area. And he was a member of that. So he could have actually lived on this property and had a house that was demolished over the years. Who knows? Could have. But a lot of the allottees, I tell people when they're doing the land recognition things for allottees, you got to remember the majority of Creek allottees never lived on those properties. Never lived on their property. Mm-hmm. Many of them were sold before, particularly the kids, before they became an adult. A good example, the General Lee Elementary School, now called Council Oak. Right. That's a Creek Freedmen kid named Ellis Manuel. He was 2 years old when he received that 15 acres. He got another 145 acres intact. But those 15 acres, his mother, who was a state black from Arkansas, married a Creek Freedman man, had these kids. She didn't get an allotment. However, her kids did and her husband did, who actually died during the allotment process. So she was put in charge of her kids' properties. She sold that property. The Oaklawn Cemetery belonged to his sister, who was 17 years old. Her name was Centennial Manuel. And did she ever step a foot on that property before it became a cemetery? I doubt it. You know, Tulsa University, another good example. It's made up of 4 allotments, 2 of which are Creek Freedmen allotments. All right. One of the allotments that make up Oral Roberts University, where Legacy Perryman allotment is mainly Tulsa, Oral Roberts University. Part of it, though, was a Creek Freedmen allotment. You know, there was a John McIntosh, I'm thinking, or John Perryman, who allotment is where the Zero Jewish community is, Creek Freedmen.
Okay.
You know, actually, this is a shocker. This is what's so disturbing about the Creek Nation kicking out its blacks. What bothers me the most. The land where the River Spirit Casino is sitting on belongs to a Creek Freedman named Louisa Mackey. The Creeks call it the Mackey Sandbar. And that land down there where the parking lot is and the casino that's out on the river, up until that river was her allotment. And the tribe has argued with me, oh, well, no, her allotment stopped at Riverside Drive. Well, Riverside Drive was not there in 1906. I'm sorry. If you didn't know that, it wasn't there. Her allotment went to the river. And your casino was actually sitting on it. And none of her descendants, not one of them, is allowed to enroll in the tribe to benefit from those services that that casino provides to tribal members. You're talking about Black Lives Matter? No, they don't. You know, we're blinded. We think it's just a police issue. It's a lot of issues. It's the federal government allowing this to go on. You know, so, and it's other people like the regular people in Tulsa not knowing the truth. You know, people say, well, I've never heard of the Tulsa Race Massacre.
Right.
And then when you say, have you heard that the tribes own its slaves? No. You know, that's just as foreign to them.
Right.
And then you got to play this catch-up game to actually, okay, this is what happened. These are the timelines. This is on and on. These are all these particular characters in this story. And they just look at you like it's just too much information. And it doesn't really affect my life, so I'm just going to ignore it. You know, and yet it's blatant, you know. I just often wonder how, other than it's an invisible story like the Tulsa Race Massacre, that it's gone on for so long, and good people who are activists have ignored it because it's not on their radar, you know. Even talking to a lot of the black folks in North Tulsa, many of them actually are getting enrolled in the Cherokee Nation. Shocked to find out that the people were actually Cherokee freedmen. I mean, really surprised. They've heard this rumor that Granny was a Cherokee, but they always thought she was a full-blood Cherokee. Granny was a princess,
Right.
you know. And then they find out she was a slave of the tribe, but she had rights, therefore passing those rights on to you. And then we help them get enrolled. And in this big fight of all of these decades that we've been fighting this issue, I often get personally mad at people, particularly prominent people, who stood back on the side and watched us nickel and dime attorneys, you know, showing up lobbying Congress with nothing. We don't have money to give these members of Congress. We're basically begging on a moral issue and hoping Congress will actually do the right thing for the freedmen. And yet you got folks who then, as soon as we won that case, the next month they got their tribal citizenship. And yet was not in the fight. What do you do about that? They have a right to get enrolled. But oftentimes I look at them and go, well, where were you? You know, when we needed $5, you know, to send a busload of freedmen up to Washington, D.C. to knock on doors. Just $5, you know, but now you're enrolled, you know. And now you have to continue to fight for your rights because had it not be for this last chief and the current chief that's in the Cherokee Nation, it could be any other chief that can actually pass Jim Crow laws in their own tribe, preventing their freedmen from running for office, or holding elective offices, or working there, or getting health care, housing, any of those type of things. It's just a matter of a council voting that in. And then what do you have to do? Take it back to court. And then the court then is going to say, this is not about the treaty, it's about a sovereignty question. Right. Does the tribe have a sovereign right to keep its foot on your neck? You know, and the most courts don't want to hear that.
Right.
And that's what I'm afraid about the Creek Freedmen, actually, is that they're going to win this next lawsuit. And hopefully I pray that the Creek Nation don't do what the Seminole Nation did and turn around and pass prohibitions against them, Jim Crow laws in modern time that whittle down their rights, the right to run for office, the right to have a job up there, the right to benefit from the casino revenues, federal revenues that come into the tribe. Right. Here's a good one. The Creek Nation recently got $300 and some million for the CARES Act. 300 and some million. Tulsa, got $30 million for its big population. The Creek Nation, with a population of 90,000, just got over $300 million that they have to spend by the end of December on whatever, on CARES Act stuff.
Right.
And they get this money not based on the 90,000. They get this money based on the population of Tulsa. You.
Really?
Everybody out there.
Really?
But they're only going to share it with their tribal members. They're going to exclude the freedmen.
Right.
They're going to exclude you.
Interesting.
Instead of saying, oh, we're going to buy plexiglass for all the public schools with this money. Or for churches, or for whatever. To keep people, to get the economy going back in Tulsa. And this is where the majority of their tribal members live, not south of the 40. They live up here. They were able to get that money. And nobody says a thing. I've asked Langford. I've sent messages. I even messaged the mayor here. Why aren't you complaining about that? You get a measly $30 million from the state, who got it from the federal government. And yet the tribe here gets $300 million plus based on the 90,000 population. But they were able to use the population of Tulsa to cook the books. And yet they don't share in it. And they're sure not sharing it with the freedmen. And yet the treaty says they equal interest in the national fund. So when we talk about Indigenous Day, I celebrate it all, but I celebrate it with my eyes wide open, that not everything is going like people think it is. Mm-hmm. That people need to wake up and realize we're no longer Indians sitting around making baskets for you to buy on the side of the road. This is a billion dollar tribes in eastern Oklahoma that generate a lot of jobs. Pretty much the state economy is based on what these tribes are doing, a huge portion of it. And yet the system is, something's wrong. And though it may not be none of your business to get into our tribal politics, only tribal members can deal with it, you at least ought to be aware of what's going on, because it's important. If you're going to help black people that are state blacks and ignore the other black people who are freedmen blacks in this state, it's not right.
Thank you. A couple more questions before I let you go. One is, I'd like you to, a few years ago, when the Cherokee freedmen won the rights to be back in the nation, we held an event here at All Souls, thanks to you. You asked us, and we said, absolutely, we'd love to host it. It was a beautiful night. I was very touched by the tears of the chief at the time of the Cherokee Nation, and his welcoming the freedmen back into the tribe and saying, from this point forward, we are one nation together, right. and whatever's happened in the past. Baker. Yeah, beautiful moment. But why did you decide to do it in a church, and particularly why did you decide to do it at All Souls Church?
Well, we were looking for a space, and the freedmen have held events like that in the past where we've recognized people. In this case, we were recognizing Chairman Bonnie Frank, who was chair of he had retired by then, but he was a member of Congress once, chair of the Financial Service Committee that was a champion for the freedmen. And we thought we would give him an honor after he retired for what he actually did. And we've done events like that in Oklahoma City and Bartlesville and on and on. And we learned the lesson that the best place to hold an event like that is actually at a church. Because we still have people that show up with, believe it or not, I hate you niggers, all this stuff. Going on. And when we hold it in public places, like in libraries, on and on and on, we get hit and interrupted, and we can't continue because there's always a protest against the freedmen.
Wow.
And so long ago, we've learned to reach out to churches with event halls that have space. I was talking to George Cromie, he's one of my best friends, one of your church members, about it, and George said, "Oh, All Souls could hold that." And I had never been here before. And mind you, I had just moved from L.A. I lived in L.A. all those years, and had just moved there. And so when I met you and came over and talked to you about it, and what was the young lady up there?
Nicole, possibly.
Nicole.
Yeah.
I met her, and I knew right away this was a good spot. I had a good feeling about it. We were looking for a place that not only addressed social issues, but had a mixture of people. I mean, we even had this in one church in Oklahoma City where we got ridiculed because it was a mainly white church from a prominent denomination. We were allowed to use their space, and afterwards we got nearly hate mail from some of their members. So that was another lesson learned, because it was a event for the freedmen, recognizing people that have helped the freedmen, but it was in Oklahoma City. And it was kind of funny to get those letters from church members. So when I felt this church, I instantly felt, wow, this is a good place, Even, I have to admit, West Hollywood has churches where I'm from, and they're all mixed, everything, gay people. This has a different feeling. It just had a different feeling about it. And I will say this, Barney Frank even said the same thing. And Barney, who's a Jew,
That's right.
don't go to church, Christian churches, for any reason. And when I told him that, oh, by the way, and I told him after he got here, because I didn't want him to sit home, I told him in the car, oh, by the way, this event is going to be at a church called All Souls. You're going to love it. And when he got here, he was kind of hesitant in the parking lot. And he came, he said, oh, my God, I love this place. You met him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He was really cool, and it was a really fun night, and the staff here was amazing. It was really, really good.
Well, we were very moved by that. In the opposite of getting hate mail, we actually showed pictures of it afterward to the whole church to say, look at this amazing event that happened and the folks who were here, and it was just a very moving event to be a part of. And part of history. It's a part of history.
Barney Frank was amazing. He was one of my best friends, but he was amazing during this time. He asked me, Moki was my nickname, he said, what's up with the Indians and the blacks? This is at my home in Palm Springs. Mm-hmm. And I told him, and he said, well, what can I do? And he wasn't one of these members of Congress that say, what can I do? Put it in their head, and it goes out this ear, and you never hear from them again.
Right.
Actually, I went to Washington, D.C. There was Mel Watts, actually. There was a lot going on. One thing, it is back to the Tulsa Race Massacre. Maxine Waters had been here for the Tulsa Race Massacre with Johnny Cochran, Charles Ogletree.
That's right, I met her. I remember that. They were doing a suit. They
Right.
did the suit. They went all the way to the Supreme Court on behalf of the. Yeah, I was with them when she came in.
Well-
I was a part of that because we were doing a reparations movement we were part of the reparations movement for the survivors at that time. And so because of my role in that, I was invited to some of these events with them.
Well, I had flew to town just to go to that. And I had picked up the second chief of the Creek Nation, who was an old full-blood Indian who had his own story about the race massacre, where his father actually hid people over in Berry Hill. And he wanted somebody to hear that story from a full-blood Indian about his relatives who were caught up in that issue of that event and how they hid out on their allotment, back in the day.
Right.
So we're sitting there, and we walked up. We got in this long line to meet Maxine Waters, who actually I already knew from L.A. But that was my first time meeting Charles Ogletree. And so I said, can we have a minute with you, brother? And Chief Berryhill started talking to him, and Charles Ogletree's face just went like this. He didn't understand what this guy was talking about. because it was an Indian perspective. And I thought, wow. So not long after that, but this was after the Supreme Court had denied the case, Diane Watson had come here. And we actually brought her here to Tulsa to specifically talk about the freedmen at the Roosevelt Library. But later on, when the 100 year of the NAACP anniversary came up, right before that, about 6 months before that, Barney called me to come out to D.C. He wanted me to meet Charles Ogletree because I had been complaining about the Greenwood issue and the fact that they were ignoring the freedmen, which is part of the story. And he said, well, Charles Ogletree is a good friend of mine. He comes to my office all the time. I want to set up something where you guys meet. So there, in Barney's office, I met Charles Ogletree. This is before the 100-year thing. And I said, do you remember me? And he said, no. I said, I met you in Tulsa. I was with this old Indian chief, and you set this blank stare over your face when he started talking about hiding black folk. And he said, oh, I vaguely, sort of remember this, but I know he's BSing me. So I said, well, we wanted to tell you that maybe had you guys included the freedmen who were tribal members in 1921 into this story, there wouldn't have been a limitation that the state could apply because the tribes are always suing the federal government over crap that happened 300 years ago.
Right.
Or the state over crap that happened 100 years ago.
Right.
And there wouldn't have been a statute of limitation had you angled some of this toward the black people who happen to be tribal members and their rights not being protected, neither by the federal government or by the states. And we're sitting here talking in Barney's office. And he was like, and then I told him about the freedmen, and he was like, wow, I didn't know all this. None of this came up in our conversation with Greenwood. None of this. He said, this is all new to me. Well, we stayed in touch, talking on the phone about it. He would call me up, asking me questions about it. Well, then the NAACP thing came up in New York City, and the freedmen needed a space to have a table. We had missed the deadline. Where they wanted to put us in this booth was in the middle of nowhere, and where Charles Ogletree was selling his books at the event center was in the middle of everything grand, And I saw him, went over, he actually signed a book for me that I bought him. And he said, well, where are you guys? I said, we're kind of in no man's land waiting in the back. He said, don't worry, you come up here and sit with us. So we went and grabbed a bunch of our freedmen stuff and set it up at his table, and people would come up to buy his book. They would sit there and go, well, what is this? Because we have pamphlets and whatever type of literatures about the freedmen.
Nice.
So, but it was stuff like that Barney did. And then when it came to an act of Congress, because there was a Cherokee case going on, Mel Watt who was a Congress member from North Carolina, had written, Barney encouraged him basically to write language that if the Cherokee Nation, because we couldn't get the Cherokees in court, they kept saying sovereign, and we couldn't get them in court. But we had the federal government in court. And basically it was a table, and the freedmen were on this side, and the federal government was on this side. And we're suing each other, like that. But what needed to be was the federal government and the freedmen on one side of the table and the Cherokee Nation on this side of the table. So how could we make this happen? So Mel Watt's language was if the Cherokees kicked their blacks out, their freedmen out, descendants of slaves out of the tribe without a federal court order, they're going to lose their Indian housing money, which was $30 million. A lot of money.
That's a lot of money.
And we got that in the NAHASDA bill, which is the Native American Housing Assistance Act, blah, blah, blah. And it went through Barney's committee. It went to the floor of the House. It passed the floor with that language in there. You could read the NAHASDA Act in 2008, in the last paragraph, it says it's in there. You kicked your blacks out without a federal court order, you're not going to get your housing money. Well, during that time of the lawsuit, there was about 2,400 enrolled Cherokee freedmen compared to the 45,000 that should be enrolled. They had rights. in this lawsuit, and the Cherokees couldn't kick them out as long as the lawsuit was going on. So there was an election, Bill John Baker and Chad Smith. During the election, Chad kicked them out. Look up Tulsa World article about it. Barney was notified, HUD was notified because it didn't pass the Senate. It ended up not being in the Senate language for NASA. It went to a conference. And in the conference, it was just the last thing in the bill. Nobody read it, apparently. So it ended up passing the conference. And then it went to the floor of both houses and passed. George Bush Jr. signed it into law, and it became a law that if the Cherokees kicked their blacks out, their freemen out, without a federal court order, they're going to lose their housing money. That's how we got them to the table in the court. Because then, if they wanted the blacks out, they had to do it in a federal court. So election came up. The freedmen that were in the tribe were supporting Bill John Baker. And mind you, Baker won by a few votes. Had the freedmen not been in there, he wouldn't have won that election. They voted for him. But before the election even happened, when it went from the primary to the general, where it was just down to two people, they booted them out. It ended up in the Tulsa World. The HUD pulled the Cherokees' money. Said, you're not going to get any housing money because you kicked the blacks out without a federal court order. So guess who ended up in the lawsuit?
Cherokee.
That's how we got them in court.
Huh. Fascinating.
And that's where we whipped their butts. Because no judge is going to read that treaty. You know, and I tell members of Congress all the time that don't want to help the freedmen, and they're acting like they've been put out of the tribe without Congress actually has to give these tribes permission to kick their blacks out because it's in the treaty. A treaty is the supreme law of the land, period. And the only way it could be changed if both sides agree to change it. That side being Congress, and the other side being the tribe. And if the tribes want the Negroes out, they have to go to Congress and tell members of Congress, saying to Inhofe, Senator Inhofe, we want to put the niggers out. I hate to say that language, but that's what this means. What are you going to do to help us? Then he would have to write a bill that actually says that and get it through the Senate and get it through the House, particularly the Congressional Black Caucus. So when I meet these members of Congress who say they're not going to help the freedmen, I always tell them, well, why don't you write a bill that tell the Creek Nation, you could put your Negroes out. It's okay with us. Because until then, you can't pretend like you gave them the right to do it. You didn't. Just like you never took the reservation status away that the Supreme Court just said.
Right.
Congress never established the Creek Nation reservation. That was the McGirt case.
Right.
It also never said, hey, you can put your blacks out. But if you're going to act like it, Senator Lankford, Congressman Horn, Kendra Horn, if you're going to act like it, and I'm talking about both Democrats and Republicans, then write the bill to make it happen. Don't sit on the side and pretend like the racism isn't going on, or it's a sovereignty issue. When in the ears of the freedmen, whenever somebody says tribal sovereignty, it's usually what a chief wants. And it's just like the image of George Wallace standing on the state capitol saying, we have a state right to treat our blacks the way we want to treat them. He used other words. So when they say sovereignty, the black people in the tribe hear state rights. Same thing.
Fascinating. What an amazing history. You've done so much. It's been
It's been
fascinating.
a lot of people.
I know, a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
Last question is, tell me some things that you really love about being part of the Creek Nation, about the Creek
I love the
culture.
people. The culture is evolved. A Creek person 300 years ago wouldn't recognize me. They wouldn't recognize somebody 100 years ago. So a Creek person 500 years ago asked you in a different language, what are you talking about when you say Creek? because that's an English word. You know, people evolve, cultures evolve, traditions evolve. What I love about the Creek Nation and being Creek, I love the people. All of my Creek friends and relatives are very loyal to me, the ones that I hang around. It's just some of the private Creek conversations that we have among ourselves are hilarious. And we get to be real open about things, you know, and that's good. And as far as the culture, I love the ceremonial grounds and what the ceremonial ground people do, which is only celebrated by a very small percentage of Creeks. I wish it was more. I wish the ceremonial grounds would open up to the Creek public more, because that's the only way you're going to make traditions survive is by putting it out there and not being introverted. Or being exclusive, but being inclusive. And a lot of the exclusion is from the fact that the Christian churches came in and raided their traditions. You know, literally on some of the ceremonial grounds, they're churches today, where the fires were put out and a church was put up. And those traditions ended for those certain tribal towns. And so I love the language. I love studying it. I don't speak it as well as I could, you know, but I got a lot of it. And I do, in my private time, I do listen to a lot of it. I don't know if you ever just sit and listen to stomp ground music, because we don't do powwows. We do ceremonial grounds and stomp music. And some of it is real deep. It just, you know, people talk about the Negro spirituals being moving. Here are ceremonial ground songs. I mean, it comes up from the earth through your feet. It's that strong, you know, and it just kind of, you know, things like that. The beauty of the tribe, not the racism part, which I literally hate. You know, and I will say this. The majority of Creek people I know today feel that the Freedmen should be members of the tribe, feel that it's wrong what happened to them in 1979. Absolutely the majority. But you do have this loudmouth minority that are screaming up and down. Those are the people that feel they're going to lose power if they allow the Freedmen in. They're going to lose control. It's the minority of people. But the majority of people get it. It doesn't affect them. It doesn't have anything to do with their own personal family lives. And they're out there speaking as loud as I am, many of them, you know. So what I love about being Creek, I like the Creek people. I like that they're engaged in our own tribal government. Many of them are interested in what's going on currently. You know, I tell people learn history so it won't repeat itself, but don't get stuck in the past. You know, don't show up at my house looking like you were born in 1810. You know, be yourself. And if the most traditional thing that you do as a Creek person, if you don't go to the ceremonial grounds, but as a traditional Creek person like me, go to Walmart, I'll see you at Walmart, because that's what we all do that. You know, because we all have traditions today that are just as important as what people did 150 years ago. And I always tell people what they did 150 years ago was part of their livelihood. It wasn't an act. It wasn't a show that you get to shut down Sunday and Monday you go back to work. These were how people actually lived their daily lives. And you putting on a show in a costume, pretending you're living in the moment, is just what that is, you know, to a lot. There are some Muskogee people who actually live that life, and I give them all the respect. They tend to be people not even involved in tribal politics. They tend to be people who live among themselves, who separate themselves completely, often from the tribal crap that goes on, even from the services, because they're not having it. They are still living that old life. But for the other 89,000 people, this is what it is, you know. And I often say there's nobody that I know who's got a key to the gate of the tribe. And you shouldn't let somebody feel that you got to get their permission to be who you are. You know, there's some things that I like to see the tribe actually do. One, like the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation has gay equality rights, where Cherokee, lesbian, gay people, whatever, can marry in tribal court, and their marriages are legal.
Right.
And the Creek Nation, no.
No. Okay.
They need to catch up.
Right.
You know, often you see people who have, and a few of them I actually know have had sex changes.
Right.
And their identities have been changed legally through federal records and whatever, but the tribe refuses to change them, which is an insult to them. You know, those things like that, it's just not the freedmen. It's other things. It's gay rights issues that need to be brought up in the tribe. You know, there's an issue that we have going on with blood quantums in the Creek Nation. You got 90% of the tribe, 85 to 90%, are less than a quarter blood and can't run for office. These are Indian members of the tribe that have no political say other than vote for a select group of people.
Because they can't hold office.
They can't hold office. So you could vote, but you can only vote for those over a quarter blood, which is a very small minority of people. And even in that minority, you got district restrictions. You got to live in a certain district. You got to have never committed a felony. I mean, this list goes on and on and on of the prohibitions.
So it's a smaller and smaller
which
group.
gets down to the bottom of the barrel. Right. And this is what you got to pick from. We need to do away with that, particularly if we're going to live in the age of McGirt, where those people right now get to pick who the judges are and the attorney general.
Right.
And yet the majority of the tribe have no say in it. The tribe has to catch up with that. And I believe our people will do that, which is one of the things I do love about the Creek people. When the challenge comes to change, they are going to change, you know, because they've been through so much, you know, and they have to adapt. And I often say, you know, when you go to the tribe, everybody's sitting on their iPhones. They're on the computers. You know, the Creek Nation has a Facebook page, a Twitter.
It's the 21st century.
Yeah. So we've done that. We can move to other things too, you know.
Right.
And there was a time with the Muskogee people, there were no horses around. They were still over in Europe, in Africa. And pigs. You know. But as soon as they got here, now all the paintings you see of old creeks are sitting on a horse.
There's a new technology back then.
It was new technology that people 100 years prior to that would have said, what is that big deer? You know, which is the Creek word for a horse is actually a big deer. You know, giant deer.
Is that right?
So people evolved. And when the horses and the wagons were over, people started driving the cars and building their roads. And their small homes no longer had dirt floors. They had floors.
Right.
You know, and people adapted the Christian religion, which was illegal back in the removal days. They did not allow Creeks to adopt Christianity.
The Christians didn't.
No, the Creeks didn't. It was illegal
the Creeks didn't.
to be a Christian in the Creek Nation.
Okay.
Because the ceremonial ground leaders, the Hilahias, the medicine makers, the religious leaders, rightly so, thought it was the end of their way of living.
Right.
And guess what happened? The Christians replaced them.
Right.
You know, there was a time when that was illegal, and then Creeks adopted it. You know, and then statehood happened, and then after statehood, all the things that have happened to Muskogee people.
Right.
So we evolved, we're resilient, we're all those things that I love. And I think I just wish that there was a more clarity of what's the beauty part of it and the ugly part of it. And that we can actually fix the ugly, and we actually can see it. You know, but as long as it's in the shadow and everybody have dim glasses on that's smudged, you don't see it because you don't want to see it.
Right.
You know, so I talk about it.
That's beautiful, and I appreciate you being here to talk to us about it. Because part of what we try to do here at All Souls is we're not afraid of complexity. We're not afraid of ambiguity, that there's a lot. And we think it's important if we're going to find justice in the world, if we're going to find mercy in the world, we need to understand the complexity of the human experience and being human. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, for sharing your immense amount of knowledge and your heart so openly. Is there anything else that you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say?
In the future, possibly next week, possibly Monday night, MSNBC is doing a story on race in America.
Right.
And the Freedmen issue will be part of that this coming week, if it's not replaced by the judicial crap that's going on in Congress right now. But if it is, it'll be the following week or whenever it's over.
Okay.
Vice from HBO is doing a story on the Freedmen coming up in November. They'll be here interviewing people.
Oh, nice.
There's been there's a new PBS documentary coming out
on the Freedmen.
The story that LeBron James is doing a documentary on Greenwood.
Right.
At the last day, they decided, I guess, to include the Freedmen story. So they came in for a big interview and interviewed a lot of Freedmen, the people, on their perspective of Greenwood.
Nice.
And they were like, God, we wish we had known, because this is kind of going to rewrite some of our story, particularly about O.W. Gurley buying 40 acres. So that should be a part of it. But when you're learning about Greenwood and black towns on, and you haven't learned about the native blacks and their contributions to the wealth of these communities and how these communities actually were formed and developed, and you're only talking about the prominent state blacks that immigrated here, you're missing half the story, if not 80% of the story. So expand your knowledge of what this is about. There's 2 wonderful books. There's a lot of books, but 2 really good ones if you're going to read about the Creek Freedmen. One is by Dr. Daniel Littlefield from the University of Arkansas.
Okay.
His book is called Africans and Creeks.
Okay.
And it's dealing with up until the Civil War, kind of post-Civil War a little bit, but way back when slavery began. Tuckabuchi is actually mentioned a lot in there. I'm not sure if it's this one, but Tuckabuchi.
All right.
Ned Tuckabuchi. There's another book called African Creeks, not African and Creeks, but African Creeks, by Gary Zeller. Really good book.
All right.
On post-Reconstruction, when the freedmen were actually in the tribal government and who they are. Incredible history.
Really?
And then Hannibal Johnson actually written a book called Apartheid in Indian Country. And he's dealing with this issue with the Cherokee Freedmen, the Creek Freedmen fighting for their rights, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole Freedmen. That's a really good book that's often overlooked about the issues that are currently going on with the tribes, not something that happened 100 years ago.
This is an already published book?
This is published. You can go down to any of these bookstores and get it.
Apartheid
in Indian Country.
Beautiful. Hannibal Johnson, a great author. We've had him speak here.
And then there's Dr. Daniel Littlefield has written Africans and Chickasaws, Africans and Choctaws, on and on, so throughout the 5 slaving tribes. There are a lot of books that he's written on that. And plus he's been a professor from the University of Arkansas on Indian studies. He gives detailed, good research sources on this history, So,
is there anything, this is kind of a random question compared to where we've been in this conversation, but our theme of the month here at All Souls in October happens to be death. So we were talking about death last week. I'm curious, is there anything that you could tell me about Creek, any historical idea about death or any ideas about death in the Creek culture?
It's the burial ceremonies and traditions like that has evolved with Christianity. Okay, when you historically read or learn about the traditional burial, as a matter of fact, I joked in L.A. once, this lady called me up, I want to bury my mother, and she passed away. She was a traditional Creek, and I want to do a traditional ceremony here in Bakersfield, California, and on and on and on. So I said, well, if you want to go back to the day, is your house, what kind of foundation your house got? Is it concrete? Are you up off the ground? What's going on with that? And she said, why? I said, well, tell me. She said, well, it's a slab concrete. I said, well, dig up a big hole in your living room and stick her down in there and cover it back up, and then go outside and burn the house down. How traditional you want this to be? Because that's what would have happened in the old days.
Is that right?
And then it evolved into other things. It depended on, you have to remember, the Creeks were many different tribes that made up the Confederacy. So many different tribes had different way of burying people.
Sure.
In Indian Territory, it was a back to nature thing, like it was in Alabama initially. Once the body is put in the ground and medicine is placed over that, then you walk away. Whatever nature decides to do, to that body, that's what happened. If it floods out and it washes down the river, nature. That's what nature intended to happen. A fungi, the creator, wanted it to happen. Then the Christians stepped in with their coffins and concrete and all that stuff, right. And their burial practice. And then you started to see, particularly after the Civil War, the cemeteries popping up all over the place here, and Confederate this and that, and people of prominence with that. But the poor people still burying people in their backyards, the old tradition. They don't have any money for the $500 to the mortuary. Right. And then when the state came along with their embalming practices, that changed into something completely different. The Creek Nation recently bought 40 acres to establish the National Cemetery of the Muskogee people. Beautiful.
Nice.
Part of it's going to go to veterans, all this stuff. It was recently in the Muskogee paper.
Beautiful.
Or on the thing. I'm actually complaining about it.
Okay.
Because I always got something to complain about. Because when the idea first arrived, it was a couple of us actually complaining to a former chief that there is no national cemetery. And if it does happen, make part of it, at least 10 acres, 20 acres, whatever of it, a back to nature cemetery, like the Creeks used to do.
Right.
Because some of us don't care to be preserved for 1,000,000 years.
Right.
Put us in the ground and let us go back to nature. What you could do is use modern day technology, create a park with beautiful trails and beautiful plants and flowers and trees, and a trail with ponds and all of that. And when a person dies, you put them in a pod or whatever, and you bury them out there, and then build a structure that would house a digital memorial. And then somebody, family member, 20 years from now, can go in that structure and click on a few buttons or whatever, and on a screen, that person will appear with their memorial that they show at these funerals these days. And as technology grow, who knows?
Yeah, it'll be a hologram. Be a hologram.
A hologram.
Yeah.
And he could tell about that person's life and on and on and on. And yet when the person wants to go visit that deceased person, just know that that person is somewhere in this 20-acre spread that they can go out and sit on a bench and smell some roses or some other flowers or enjoy the scenery and know, hey, my ancestor, my grandmother, my grandfather, my brother, my sister, whoever is out there. And that nature, which is the traditional Creek way, is dealing with it. So
that's a beautiful vision.
That's
that. Thank you. I'm glad I asked that last question because that I might be able to use that with our theme this month. Thank you so much. Really, thank you. We recorded a lot, so I'm going to have to figure out exactly what part to use. But what I can imagine is using all of it in different chunks in different ways, if it's okay with you, and putting some stuff out on different themes related to what we talked about. Because man, you wealth of information, incredible.
I appreciate your help, and you've done great. I mean, what you did with the cartoon. That has stirred the pot.
Oh my God.
Good.
I'm glad. I was on.